In planning for retirement, one of the biggest variables is how much a person's going to spend. But how do you figure out what your spending is going to look like in retirement? That's our topic on today's episode of Friends Talk Financial Planning. Hi, I'm John Shearer, and I run a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin.
I'm Bridget Sullivan-Mermel. I've got a fee-only financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois. John, before we start talking about spending in retirement, let's ask everybody to subscribe. Helps YouTube and other viewers find us. John, so let's talk. Someone comes to you and says, how much am I going to spend in retirement? How do I figure this out? I've just realized that that's one of the number one factors that I need to consider. What do you?
Yeah. And I'd like to just pause right there for a second too and talk about, that is the big factor, right? Oftentimes I know we'll get folks that ask us, well, tell me about how I can save more for retirement, or what's the withdrawal strategy, or some of these other, legitimate, important questions that come down the road. But the big one is that I can't tell a person, well, how much are you spending, Bridget? How much are you going to spend in retirement? And that's the variable that makes such a big difference, especially when you extrapolate out over, a 30-year retirement. That number, if it's, 75,000 versus 100,000, that's a big difference over a 30-year period. And so one of the things that we talk about is sort of a combined issue is figure out what you're spending now. Right. Don't necessarily project up, but start. What did I spend last year? Right. We've talked about it on the show before. Take credit card statements, take bank statements. What literally went out the door? All right. Hard to argue that that's what you spent last year. Right. And then I think that we should take and go, let's assume that that's the base for spending going forward, especially as you're close to retirement. If you're 20 years away, it's a little bit harder to predict, right? There's some more variables. I'm 5 years away. You go, all right, what I'm spending now is likely what we're going to spend in the future, which is a different tactic than many people in the financial world take, where they say, well, let's assume that you spend 80% of your current income or something like that, and use it based on your income. And I go, listen, let's talk about spending, because that's tangible, it's real. We can figure out what you spent last year and just start with that and say, listen, the baseline is, let's assume that we're going to spend tomorrow what you spent yesterday.
Right. Yeah, because I think people have their habits established. This comes from actually Burt Whitehead, who founded ACP, and he really influenced me in this regard, because in the industry, a lot of people say take 80% of your current spending or 60% of your current spending and use that as your number. But I really think that 100% works better, because what I see with people is retirement is not a time to aspire to cut back.
Right.
It's a time to aspire to expand.
Right. Especially in that early part.
Life, not cut back your life.
Right.
So that's when we're working with people, that's what we're trying to get them to think about. Like, how can you expand your horizons? So saying, how can you expand your horizons and spend less is tough.
Right. And I agree with, right. These, when you project out, hey, we're going to spend less than we're currently bringing in, sort of a thing, you go, hang on a second, I probably want to spend more than that.
Right.
And that leads me to, one of the things I've been saying for a while is that, expenses, I used to call it an hourglass, where expenses kind of go up as you get into retirement, because now you finally got time and you got some dough and you want to go do things. And then over time, it sort of filters down. And to use Burt Whitehead's term, at some point you've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, right? Like, okay, for various reasons, either I've already done so many things, or physically or mentally, I'm not interested in doing those things anymore, travel and other things like that. And so studies have been coming out here in the last 5 or 10 years that are verifying that anecdotal evidence, and the things that we believe from real life things, is that, and they call it a retirement smile, where it sort of starts in retirement at a high level. I think it kind of goes up, as you just said, but then it goes down over time. And really, and maybe for viewers, think about people in their 70s and 80s and into their 90s, that, spending is not going up, typically speaking, for those folks, for things like travel and entertainment and those sort of lifestyle things. For many people, it flattens out and goes down in a lot of cases, because they're just not as active in various fashions as they have been. Not everybody, right? It's not the general, but if you take on average, you kind of go, hey, that's the expected thing. And then, of course, at the end of life, when we got more healthcare costs, that you tend to have that smile comes back up, that spending. So you might hear as you read or view other things, the retirement smile, the spending smile. And that's what that means, is spending that goes down at gradually over a course of retirement and then comes back up at the end of life. But it's like, listen, I kind of like that bump in the first part, which is where I get a sort of weird hourglass shape to my smile. Or maybe it's a Picasso kind of smile with the curve that doesn't go the same direction or something like that, right?
Right.
But it's one of those where, hey, and when I'm, 62 or 668 or 72, like I want to go out and do things, right? I've always wanted to, go to South Africa on a photo safari, or I mean, all these sorts of things, right? Cool, let's go do that. When I'm 88 or 92, but either I've done those things or I go like, yeah, that doesn't have so much appeal to me. I have more things that, and I encourage folks to think about this. We just had somebody who were a client that was in, we are talking about, what's it like for your folks? Because both the parents were in their 90s, and you go, how was their spending looked? And I didn't know the answer. I mean, maybe I always want to know what's the truth so I can decide, are we giving good? I mean, oh yeah, boy, they don't spend nearly what they did 10 years ago. Okay, that's, not surprising, but also like, okay, that helps to formulate some of the thought process as we think again about, all right, if I'm, 58 and trying to retire at 62, and how do I plan out the next 30 years of spending? Look at some of the experiences that you have in your life, and maybe even talk with your parents, relatives, friends that are a little bit older, and what it's been like for them.
Mhm. Yeah, another thing I want to bring up about the 70 and spending more, at the beginning of retirement is I like to encourage my clients at that age to think about their housing. Okay, so
Mm,
it's if you want to make changes in your house, either by moving, it's a lot easier at 70 than 80, 85. I mean, I just moved and I'm last year, I'm not 80, and it was a lot of work. And this is not something that gets easier as you age. So putting it off, same with dealing with contractors. I mean, it's not easier to deal with contractors when you're older than when you're younger. No, so it's something that I try to encourage people to engage with when they're younger, although I get a lot of resistance. So, but I had this one couple who moved when they're 85, and what a lot of work,
yeah,
for
yeah,
them, kids, it's just, and how miserable were they for 2 years at 85, a time in life you don't really want to be miserable. So anyway,
right,
thinking about that, and again, spending some money if you need to spend some money at that point, I think is, getting the new garage, redoing the kitchen, getting a new bathrooms, maybe putting in a couple extra railings. Great, do
right,
it when you're at that age versus putting it off, because it's going to happen. It's like,
right.
so why not do it now? That's something that I encourage people to spend on at that age.
It's interesting, Bridget, as we talk about using our current spending as the baseline, and maybe this retirement smile thing that doesn't give a lot of practical advice. Like, okay, so how do you actually think about that stuff, right? One of the things that I think in my experience, I'm interested in yours, is that when you factor those things in, like how do you functionally do that? And I think my take is, listen, if we take what our starting point now, what are you spending now? Yep, it's probably going to, and I just use that and say, listen, let's assume that that's a baseline, and maybe factor in some inflation on that. And I go, yep, in the early years, you're probably going to spend some more than that. And in the middle years, you're probably going to spend some less than that. That's probably going to go for quite some time. And I think, and experience has shown that it's not, number one, is really difficult to do, but it's not necessary to figure out, well, how much more am I going to spend in those early years and how much less in those middle years and things. And like, no, it tends to average, taking that average cost with
Right.
the starting point, and sort of going, hey, we like to talk about financial planning as a process, not an event. Not here's the schedule and boom, put it on a shelf and it happens. Like, no, there's going to be some more and there's going to be some less. And maybe we go through a 2008, 2009, and market goes down and you spend a little bit less because that's how you lived your life. And it's a moving target. So I don't think we need to stress too much about it, that it averages out over time, and going back to that, using what you're currently spending is really the most effective way to do that. And what's
Right.
your take on that?
I agree. I do have another person that, or a couple that I worked with, that when they were working with me, they were both employed, and one person had a high income. And they didn't say okay savers, but they weren't over savers for sure. And I was like, you're gonna have to, you can't. I was skeptical because I haven't seen people cut back on their spending that much when they're retired.
Yeah.
I really don't encourage people to do that, but they're like, when we retire, we're moving to Maine and we're going to cut down our spending. I'm like, okay, right. But okay, we'll use those numbers, but it's sure enough they have. And they're happy. They're really happy. And I think part of it is if so when you were talking about people when they're 90 and what they like, and these two aren't that in their 90s at this point, but it's like, if you can think about where's your happy place and then try to get your 80s and 90s in your happy place. So for instance, with my dad, he had a condo on the beach and he loved this little, there's a little performance space next to the beach. And it took about, it was like maybe half a block away. But every night he'd go down to that performance space and there were local people basically pick up bands and you they pass the hat. And and then he talked to all the people that are around, and, that was his happy place. And he, in his 90s, and that totally hit the spot for him. So, and for the other people too, that, they love seeing him there. So, it's interesting because I see that people as they get older really do appreciate the simple things more than the people who are younger tend to be more distracted.
No, that's it's reminds me of Charlie Munger was sort of semi-famous for a lot of things, but one of his quotes was, the key to happiness in life is having low expectations. Right, which is kind of a funny way to put things, but the reality is, I want to, travel the world and do these things, and yep, it's really awesome to do that. But on a day-to-day basis, being able to go down to the performance place and see what local musicians come up and do that, and finding joy in the simple things, right? There's a lot to be said for that.
Right.
So I think that's maybe a great place to wrap up, and just sort of circling back to how should you think about retirement spending? How do you plan for that? And it's take what you're spending now, especially if you're close to retirement. Assume that that's going to be the baseline going forward. And that really has been very effective in getting close so that people can plan on an ongoing basis for retirement. So with that, I'm John Shear, and I run a family financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin.
And I'm Bridget Sullivan Mermel. I've got a family financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois. We're both proud members of the Alliance of Comprehensive Planners, which is a group of family financial planners from all over the country. John and I are both taking clients, but if you're looking for a client who kind of thinks like we do in your area, check out acplanners.org.
And don't forget, hit that subscribe button.